This will be our final video for the digestive system. We're going to go back into the organs and talk about the large intestine. So after food leaves the small intestines, it will pass through that ileocecal valve and it will enter into the large intestines. So looking at the large intestines, we can actually break it up into three major sections. The first section that the residue will enter into is called the cecum. Then it will travel through a majority of the large intestines that is referred to as the colon. And the colon can be broken up into four different sections known as the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, and the sigmoid colon. And then the final portion is the rectum. So the large intestines are actually shorter than the small intestines, but they're called the large intestines because of the diameter. And the large intestines will receive about 500 mils of indigestible residue every single day. And the main focus of the large intestines is going to be for the reabsorption of water. And so the residue will be reduced to about 150 mils by the time it gets to the end of the large intestines. And then that residue will be eliminated by the process of defecation. So when the food substance first enters into the large intestines, it's going to enter into this pouch-like region. It's going to be kind of like this swelling here, and it connects the large intestines and the small intestines just inferiorly to that ileocecal valve. Recall that that is a sphincter that will prevent waste from flowing backwards into the small intestines. So when residue starts to fill up the cecum, it will actually pinch that valve shut so that way the waste cannot go backwards. And then there's going to be this appendix. It's actually called the variform appendix. Think of it as a long, kind of skinny lymph node. It is densely populated with lymphocytes, and so it is a lymphatic organ. And it's located at the lower end of that cecum. And variform means worm-like or worm form, so it's kind of what it looks like. It's this long, skinny, worm-like organ. So once food starts to move through the intestines, it's actually going to go through this next four portions referred to as the colon. And so when the substance is going upwards, it will be ascending. So that portion of the intestines is called the ascending colon. And then right at about the liver, there's going to be this bend or flexure where it will change direction. So this is called the hepatic flexure or the right colic flexure. And then the colon will go transversely through the abdominal cavity right underneath the stomach. And that portion is called the transverse colon. And then there will be this flexure or bend right at about where the spleen is. And so that is called the splenic flexure or the left colic flexure. And then there is the descending portion. So the residue will go down the descending colon and it will make this kind of S-shaped bend where it actually starts to go posteriorly in the body, and it makes this kind of S shape that's called the sigmoid colon. And then we'll have the final portion that is called the rectum. So here we have a picture from your book. You can see that this portion is the ileum, that last section of the small intestines. And then you'll have that cecum where the food substance will go into, and you'll see that appendix hanging off of the cecum, and you can see it's kind of this this large pouch-like structure. And then you'll have the ascending colon and the right colic flexure, then the transverse colon and the left colic flexure going down into the descending colon and the sigmoid colon down into the rectum. And then there'll be the anus, which is the opening to the outside world. So the function, once we get to the end of the intestines, now we're going to be here in the rectum, and that's where we're going to have temporary storage of the feces. So this rectum is located between the sigmoid colon here and the anus, which is that the very end. And the most distal portion of the rectum is referred to as the anal canal. That's the final 3 centimeters right before the anus. And there are muscles that are part of your pelvic floor called levator ani muscles. And there are also these anal columns and sinuses that will release a lot of mucus and lubricant into the anal canal during defecation. And there's also going to be these large veins that form these plexuses within the anal columns and around the opening of the anal canal. And so you might have heard of somebody who has hemorrhoids. So that's when these large veins actually distend and protrude into the anal canal. And sometimes they can get really bad where they end up bulging outside of the anus. So let's recall the layers. When it comes to the alimentary canal, you have the innermost mucosa layer, then you have the submucosa, and then there's the muscularis externa. And most of the digestive tract, including the esophagus, has 2 layers. There's the inner circular layer, and there's the outer longitudinal layer. In the stomach, there is that 3rd oblique layer, but most of the digestive tract has these 2 layers. And the thick outer longitudinal layer becomes this skinny little ribbon-like strip. It no longer goes all the way around the alimentary canal in a 360-degree fashion. It's going to be this thin little strip. So when it contracts, it's going to kind of pull the colon and bunch it up like an accordion. And when it pulls, the substance is going to get pulled up into these little pouches called haustra. And then there are 2 sphincters that are going to control whether the feces can pass through the anal canal. There's the internal anal sphincter that is made up of smooth muscle, and there is an external anal sphincter that is made up of skeletal muscle. So remember that smooth muscle is involuntary, so you cannot control this internal anal sphincter. There's going to be reflexes that control whether or not this sphincter is opened or closed. But luckily, we do have voluntary control over our skeletal muscles. So the external anal sphincter, our brains will have to decide when we're going to relax that sphincter to allow passage of the fecal material into hopefully a toilet. But this is also why some babies take a while to build up the strength in those skeletal muscles. And so, it takes them till they're about 2 or 3 for them to be able to have the strength of those external anal sphincters and control when they can go to the bathroom. So here we have this diagram again, and you can look at that Taenia coli, that longitudinal muscle layer that is now very, very thin. And when it contracts, it's going to pull. It's going to pull on the intestines, and it's going to kind of bunch it up like that accordion, and it's going to fill up these hostra. And so if we look at the very end of the large intestines, we're going to have the rectum, which is going to store the feces. And you have the last 3 centimeters, that's that anal canal. And then you can see that there are those hemorrhoidal veins. And so those are what can actually start to just fill up, and they can protrude into this anal canal. And if they get large enough, they'll even protrude out of the anus. And then you can see that there are these anal sinuses and anal columns that are going to have those cells and produce a bunch of mucus and lubricant. And then you can see that internal anal sphincter here made out of smooth muscle. And then you have that external anal sphincter that is made up of the levator ani muscle, part of the pelvic floor, part of that pelvic diaphragm, and that is the skeletal muscle that we can control. So here you have some pictures in a cadaver with the portions of the large intestines highlighted. We've got the cecum here. You can see that variform appendix. And then this portion here is actually showing the ileum and then the ileocecal junction right before the food passes into the large intestines and goes into that cecum there. And then you can see here we've got the ascending colon going upwards, and then the right colic flexure, then going over to the transverse colon and the left colic flexure, down the descending colon, and that kind of S sigmoid colon there. And here we have an X-ray showing the same structures. There is that cecum, the ascending colon. You can see the transverse colon, descending, the sigmoid. Actually, you can see how it really does go posteriorly there and kind of loops back around and then goes down into the rectum. And so this picture, you can really see those hostra very, very nicely. And you can see that tinea coli, longitudinal muscle there. And then what you're looking at here are omental appendages, because the large intestines are connected to the greater omentum. And remember that the greater omentum is really, really fatty. So that's what you're seeing there are these omental appendages. And you can see that fat hanging down, and you can see the hostra here. This is that fat right there. And then make note of this wavy longitudinal line here that's going across. That is the tinea coli there, that longitudinal muscle. And here we have the layers, and once again, I want to remind you of the epithelial tissue. So we have the mucosa layer, that is the deepest layer, and then you have the submucosa layer, and then you have the muscularis externa layer. And if you guys recall that mucosa layer is going to be made out of a simple columnar epithelial tissue. And one of the characteristics of simple columnar epithelium is for there to be goblet cells embedded in between the epithelial cells. And so if you look at this picture of the colon here, every one of these little white circles is a droplet of mucus being produced by these goblet cells. So we're going to start to see a huge increase in the goblet cells of the epithelium. And so that's kind of a hallmark of the colon. Once we get to this area, we're going to just see lots and lots of goblet cells all throughout the large intestine. And so this is just another image showing you those intestinal glands and all of those goblet cells. So within the large intestines, the major function is going to be the absorption of water, and then some salts will be absorbed with the water back into the body. And we're also going to have removal of waste, which is now called feces. And so there is actually a large amount of bacteria within your large intestine. There's over 800 species and about 3 pounds worth. And those bacteria are actually really good for us. We have a symbiotic relationship with them. We provide them a nice, moist environment where they can live and grow, and they help us break down things that we don't have the enzymes to break down otherwise, such as cellulose or pectin. Pectin is found in plants like strawberries, and we can't break that down. We don't have pectinase, but the bacteria can. And there's other carbohydrates that our cells don't have the enzymes to break down. And then these bacteria, as a byproduct of just them breaking things down, is actually producing vitamin B and vitamin K. So sometimes when we have these these strong doses of antibiotics, it can actually disrupt these healthy bacteria. And if we disrupt them, we aren't going to get the vitamin B and vitamin K that we need. So we can actually end up with vitamin deficiencies from antibiotic use. And so these microbes are going to work together with your intestinal cells to produce gas. The fancy term for gas is flatus, which is why you might have heard of somebody having flatulence if they are gassy. On average, people produce like 500 mils of intestinal gas a day, but most of it's going to be reabsorbed in the large intestines. And a majority of flatus is actually swallowed air, but the bacteria is going to add to it. And when they do, there's going to be some odors that are affected as well. So what makes the odor is hydrogen sulfide, indole, and sketal that are going to produce the odor. And you got to actually be kind of careful during surgeries, because if you use an electrical cauterization, these gases, like hydrogen sulfide gas, are explosive. So you have to be careful during surgery when using cauterizations. So the large intestines, remember, they're going to take that 500 mils of undigestible waste product and condense it down to about 150 mils. And so that takes about 36 to 48 hours to reduce that residue into feces. And it's going to spend most of the time in the transverse colon. And at this point, we are no longer breaking things down. We're not releasing enzymes, and we're not chemically changing the residue at all. We're focusing on the reabsorption of water and some salt. Your feces is going to be about 75% water and 25% solid. So what's going to make up these solids is mostly bacteria and undigested fiber, about 30% bacteria, 30% undigested fiber. 10 to 20% is going to be your fats, and then there'll be a really small amount of mucus from those goblet cells, some proteins, and some non-reabsorbed salts, along with those digestive secretions. And there's going to be epithelial cells that are just dying and get sloshed off of the surface of the epithelial membrane, and then those will be excreted in the feces as well. So if the stomach begins to stretch because we're getting food, that stomach stretching, or if the duodenum receives some chyme and there's stretching in the duodenum, that is actually going to signal the large intestines and the colon to begin to contract. Because if the food or the large and we start over. If the stomach or the duodenum are stretching, that means food is coming down. And if food's coming down, the intestines, specifically the colon, needs to contract and it needs to empty so that way it can get ready for that incoming food. And so you have these haustral contractions that are going to be very slow, and they're more of segmental movements that really last about 30 minutes after the food moves into the large intestines. And when these haustra get distended or expand, that is going to stimulate them to contract. And that contraction is going to churn and mix the residue, which will promote water to be reabsorbed along with some salt. And then the other type of movement that's going to happen are mass movements. These are much slower, but they're very powerful. And they're going to push the waste towards the rectum. And this happens about 3 or 4 times a day. And so these mass movements are going to be triggered by those gastrocolic and duodenocolic reflexes, where the stomach is stretching or the duodenum is stretching, and the filling of the stomach or the duodenum stimulates the motility of the colon. And that will actually move the residue several centimeters, and eventually it will make its way to the rectum for storage. So the rectum is going to collect and store all of this undigested waste. And when the rectum starts to fill, it's going to stimulate defecation by 2 different reflexes. So there is an intrinsic defecation reflex that will work entirely within the myenteric plexus that produces a relatively weak response. And so as the rectum stretches, it's going to be detected by these stretch receptors that are in the plexus. And that stretch signal will travel through the plexus to the muscularis, causing it to contract. And that will in turn cause the internal anal sphincter to relax, right? If we pull on these muscles here, it's going to open up that internal sphincter. But luckily, we still have this external sphincter, right? That's made out of skeletal muscle, and that has to be voluntarily relaxed in order to release the built-up feces through the anus. And so defecation is only going to occur if both the external anal sphincter and those puborectalis muscles are voluntarily relaxed. If we are not voluntarily relaxing those muscles, then the external sphincter is going to be closed. And then we'll have abdominal contractions called the Valsalva maneuver, which will increase, we've all done it, it increases abdominal pressure and it compresses the rectum to help with the passage of feces through the anus. So if we look at what happens as feces leaves the sigmoid colon and starts to fill up the rectum, that feces is going to start putting pressure on the surrounding tissues where that plexus is found. So feces will stretch the rectum and it's going to stimulate these stretch receptors, which will then transmit signals to the spinal cord by a sensory or afferent nerve. The spinal reflex is going to stimulate contraction of the rectum. So if we follow that here to number 2, right, we're seeing here we're going to stimulate contraction of the rectum, and the spinal reflex at the same time over here is going to also relax the internal anal sphincter. So this internal anal sphincter will be relaxed. But there's going to be impulses from the brain that ultimately prevent the untimely defecation by keeping the external anal sphincter contracted. So that's what you're seeing here in number 4 is the external anal sphincter being contracted. And so defecation will only occur if this sphincter also relaxes. And that ends our journey from the mouth to the anus and from food to feces.